Hi, it's Dr. Simeon Roger for the Leader Revolution. And we're here with the second in our series of videos prompted by this crisis in Ukraine, prompted by the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And we're going to be looking at strategic decision making in this particular video. So, very much part of leadership, very much part of managing a culture is the ability to make strategic decisions. And how did this work on the international stage? As we were building up to this current crisis, because right now, as I'm making this video, we're at the end of day 6 in this invasion. And, in the run up to this conflict, the situation was very well summed up by one Ukrainian analyst who said, the problem is that the West is playing by the rules, Putin is playing with the rules. And indeed, this was the case. At every turn, the West was seeking a diplomatic solution. And that's really baked into the Western DNA to attempt to do everything by diplomacy, uh, and while failing to notice that diplomacy, kind of like marriage counseling, only works when both parties want a solution, when both parties are willing to negotiate in good faith. And this was definitely not the case. It was back in the early 1970s, if you go back to relations between the West and the old Soviet Union. By the early 1970s, both sides were more than willing to sit down at the table, and this led to a much more stable international order at the time. It led to détente, to the relaxation of tensions between East and West. It led to the entire framework of strategic nuclear arms control, which was in place for a very long time. It really worked quite well at that time. But this is a very different situation because this is not a situation of sitting down to negotiate. This is a situation where Putin essentially said, we have security concerns, but instead of saying we have security concerns, let's talk, it was, here are our demands. You must accede to them or else. So he was holding a gun to Ukraine from the beginning and saying, you accede to these demands or else. And he threatened all kinds of rather vague, nasty things that could happen if the West did not simply accede to these demands. So this was extortion, not diplomacy. Uh, And these demands, of course, were completely outrageous. They were that Ukraine must be demilitarized, that neither Ukraine nor Georgia will ever be allowed to join NATO or the EU, and that, as a matter of fact, NATO must pull back all of its military assets and keep them permanently out of the eastern part of the alliance, essentially out of the old Warsaw Pact countries. So, what Putin was trying to do here essentially is rewrite the end of the Cold War. But more than that, there's something else going on here, which really is very much key, and everyone has to understand this. Is Putin's vision of the world, which is very much a 19th century vision. It's a vision of competing great powers, each one surrounded by its sphere of influence and its buffer states, competing great powers, and that was exactly the international system that led to two world wars. And after the Second World War ended 77 years ago, just about, the Europeans said, we are so done with that, not going back to that. And hence the genesis of the rules based international order, the post World War II era, which has been an era of really unparalleled prosperity for so much of the world, and unparalleled peace. And this is what Putin rejects. So he wants to be part of the international order when it comes to benefiting economically, but he does not want to be bound by it. And he wants to be able to dictate to former parts of the Soviet Union, like Ukraine, like Belarus, like the Baltic states, what their future can be, what's allowed, what's not. And he wants, above all things, to keep them out of NATO and the EU. He wants to keep them out of the Western sphere of influence. In other words, out of Western culture, out of the sphere of countries who are thriving democracies, basically. That's what he does not want. He wants to be able to call the shots. He wants them to be basically post Soviet satrapies controlled by Moscow. And that's very understandable. Putin is essentially Muscovy incarnate. Muscovy, the predecessor of modern Moscow. Someday we'll go into that. But Muscovy has always been a brutally authoritarian state since its genesis hundreds of years ago. And Putin is just the incarnation of this. So when you're holding a gun to somebody's head, uh, an approach that's based fundamentally on reason and good faith is not necessarily going to work. Now, the West had, as a matter of fact, quite a number of tools it could have used to coerce Putin at the time to make him see reality, but none of these were used. And that was part of the problem. The Western approach has been compared to appeasement. I don't believe that that is quite correct. So, in the run up to this particular crisis, when Russia began its military buildup on the Ukrainian border in late November, from then until now, or from then until February 24th, the date of the invasion, it was not quite appeasement in the sense the West was not actually giving in. The West did not compromise on any principle of the rules based international order. And that's what has Putin so furious. But strangely enough, he didn't change his stance or attempt even to come to any type of understanding. And this was kind of interesting to us because when he made his outrageous demands, the first thought was, okay, this is an extreme negotiation position and it'll go down from there. You know, you start with your giant wish list and you're willing to compromise here. That was not the case. He has never changed up till right this minute. He has never changed his demands. So there was never any thought in Putin's mind of actual negotiation. That wasn't even on the table. This was pure extortion. Um, Now, those demands, of course, as I said, were ludicrous, and there was no way he should have known. He probably did know ahead of time there was no way those were going to get anywhere. But I think he thought he could give it a try, give bullying a try, see if it works. It might not, but you know, what have you got to lose? So that's probably what Putin was doing. Um, and the real problem here is, you know, is that the West left the initiative in Putin's hands. So while it wasn't quite appeasement, we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. What the West did that was a strategic mistake was to leave the initiative in Putin's hands. There was never a time between the initiation of the crisis in November and up to the moment of the invasion. There was never a time when Putin was on the back foot. There was never a time when he felt threatened. He was always calling the shots, always playing, you know, pulling on the strings, making people dance to his tune. And the West never took that initiative away from him because the West was focused on one thing. The West, not only its bureaucracy, but the many of the leaders also were focused on one thing, which was above all prevent a war. Unfortunately, history will show that when you're dealing with a thug like Putin, if you're the more that you try to avoid a war, the more likely you are to have one. The more likely you are to be drawn into one because all of your actions will be looked upon by this type of personality as weakness. And indeed, that's exactly what happened. So I think Putin's first shock was to realize how united the West actually was, and they really did follow through on sanctions. And these sanctions really began to hurt the Russian economy. So it really wasn't until a few days ago, 2, 3 days ago, that Putin was finally put on the back foot, that he finally lost the initiative. And he lost that partly because of the effective defense of the Ukrainians and that the Russian military really looked rather pathetic and fell drastically behind its own schedule. We'll talk about that some other time. But the combination of military failure and the economic impact of the sanctions, which was pretty immediate, surprisingly so, that put him on the back foot finally. But that's just the thing. Until the West takes away the initiative from Putin, we're in a much more dangerous place. To a certain degree, we've taken away the initiative now, though not entirely. But unfortunately, hostilities have already begun, which could put Putin in a very desperate situation. How threatened is his regime, in fact? Another thing we'll talk about later in a different video. So while the West's approach was really, I don't believe it can be called appeasement, but it's very much like containment. So if you looked at the old Cold War strategy of containment, the idea was here's the Soviet bloc, and they're always trying to push outward, and we will contain them and push back all around that periphery. Well, of course, that left all the initiative to the Soviets. So containment as a strategy was developed by a moron. Only a moron could ever come up with containment because it always leaves the initiative to the other side. That is never the strategy you want. So That was really part of the problem. And the present situation, of course, came about in part because of the West's comfort loving nature, because the West typically, Western politicians do not react to serious situations until they become acute situations. And that's just the way it is. It's really there are systemic flaws in the way democracy is currently constituted, not with democracy itself, but the way it's currently constituted. There are significant disincentives in the system for anyone in a place of leadership to really take the long-term view, take the wide view of what's going on and react ahead of time. It simply doesn't happen. So people are reacting only as situations become acute. Yet, as the Ukrainians have so often said, look, we've been at war for 8 years. You're pretending the war started last week. It didn't. We've been at war since 2014. Putin's annexation of Crimea, Putin's development of this sort of fake civil war in the Donbass. Look, we've been at war for all that time. Yes, but the West always wants to be comfortable. The West always wants to do business as usual, and it's a very rude shock when something like this comes up. But this did not come out of nowhere. This was highly predictable. In fact, Putin was probably quite emboldened when Belarus fell serendipitously back into his orbit. He didn't expect that. But so, last year when Lukashenko won the election and his population disputed that and was on the verge of overthrowing him, that drove Lukashenko, the dictator in Belarus, back into Putin's arms out of necessity. And it was only out of necessity because Lukashenko and Putin actually don't like each other. It's a giant clash of egos. Uh, so they don't like each other, but right now, Lukashenko is Putin's puppet. So, in other words, Belarus belongs to Moscow. And getting that part of his former Soviet periphery back in Putin's mind, that meant, oh, well, if I have that much back, maybe I can get Ukraine too. And he'd already been thinking about that and interfering with Ukrainian internal affairs massively, et cetera, et cetera. So, but we have to think strategically, look, that buffer that he wants back so badly, that consists of Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic states. Things to think about in the very near future. So the real lesson here right now for anyone in a position of political or bureaucratic leadership is, look, if you're being pulled into negotiations with another party, have a good hard look at the overall situation. What is the situation? Is it a situation that calls for negotiation? Or is it simply extortion, as this is? Is it a place where the other party is prepared to sit down in good faith? Or is this just an exercise in futility, a delaying tactic, a distraction, as it has been here all along? So that's it for now. A little bit to think about when it comes to strategic decision making. That's a mouthful. Strategic decision making. And we'll be learning a lot more, I'm sure, from this crisis as it goes on. So we'll talk to you again soon. Dr. Simeon Roger for the Leader Revolution. Back in a bit.